Test. Okay, looks like it's working. Okay, so our goal today then is basically to try to do similar to last day when we did notes. I'm basically going to read you guys through as many definitions and terms as you need to know. Um, I won't lie to you guys, we haven't covered entirely all of the biocurriculum because honestly, if I could teach you an entire unit in 2 days, like I'd be the greatest teacher in the world to do that. So I am definitely shorting a few things here, okay? But my personal opinion is I think I covered about 80% of it, and I think that that should be enough to help get you guys through the challenge test. Because like really at the end of the day, we're just trying to pass the thing, right? So I will let you, by the way, like take whatever you write on that sheet into your challenge final. Okay, here, why don't I sit over here? Then I'm not looking through you guys as much. So face you all. So whatever you write on there, as many definitions as you want to, feel free bring that into your final. Okay. So our goal today then is to very specifically talk about how plants function, and we watched that Magic School Bus episode on Friday. So we're kind of going to just re-go over all that terminology. So the first word we've got on here is called tissue. Okay. Tissue in humans or animals or plants is all the same thing. It's where cells group together in similar concepts, right? Like brain tissue would be a good example, right? All the brain cells together is brain tissue. Or heart tissue, right? Do brain cells do the same thing as heart cells? Well, no. And the same thing happens in plants. In plants, there's some tissue, and its job is to do photosynthesis. And there's other tissue, and its job is to do protection. And so if you guys remember, like there's the outside of the plant, it's one cell thick, it's called the cuticle. It's on a future slide. But its job is not to do photosynthesis. Something else's job is, right? So long story short, cells together doing the same thing are called tissues. Do you guys remember what happens when you put multiple tissues together? Good, and multiple organs together gives you a system. Perfect. Yeah. So okay, now another word on here I need you guys to know is called meristems. And basically, the meristems are the types of cells that grow and multiply into new cells. So that's how things can grow. In humans or in animals, those are called centrioles. In plants, they're called meristems. And basically, it can do one of two things. It either makes your root system or your shoot system. And I think I paused the Miss Frizzle video right off the bat because she was wearing that dress, right? And then the half the dress was like above the ground and half the dress was below the ground. So I'm sure I have this on another slide, but you guys should pretty much know these two words. I'll highlight them for you here. You should know root and shoot. Right, root and shoot. Root is everything that is below ground, and the shoot is everything that is above ground. Yeah. And really, the plant grows in two directions. We don't think of this so much, probably, but really, for as much as the plant grows upwards, it should also be growing downwards, right? And I mean, think of this in southern Alberta. If you have a tree that does not have very good roots and it's windy, yeah, it's knocking right over, right? And so a good tree builds like large roots that anchor it into the ground, right? And that way it doesn't get knocked over and it gives it a lot of internal support so that it can draw its water from the ground. Because if you guys recall from that video on Friday, plants have to make their own food and they really need three things to make their own food. One, they need sunlight. Well, as long as they're outside and it's sunny out, that's taken care of. Two, they need water. Well, the roots are what brings in the water. The final thing is they need to have carbon dioxide gas from the air, and that comes in through the leaves. So long story short is what I'm getting at is that you need to have good solid roots because one of the three main components for your food is water, and you want to draw in as much water as you can. So, wait, why don't I move to the next slide here if that's it? Actually, you guys are still writing. I'll pause. Actually, I probably can go to the next slide because it's just got the pictures of what I discussed there. So you've got your shoot system and your root system, which basically is above and below ground. Um, there are different types of organs still, though. And so this picture that I found, it actually went beyond just showing the systems. Like for example, this would be an organ. This would be a reproductive organ. You guys know how like bees or other insects they end up carrying like pollen from plant to plant to help them do that, right? That would be, I guess, similar to how humans have reproductive organs, right? So leaves would be another type of organ. So, okay, let's move on. Here's a picture of a whole bunch of terminology words that we need to discuss, and I don't know whether you might find it helpful in this section here, rather than to write out what it is verbally when you do your little notes, you may even want to draw a picture. Like that might be helpful to you. I don't know. It's completely up to you because they're your notes. But you guys write down what you want. I'll give you the review of what we learned about in the Magic School Bus episode. The top layer, 1 cell thick. The reason why it's 1 cell thick is it's purely for protective purposes. It's like the skin. Okay. Stuff is not supposed to go through the cuticle, so much so that you can even actually feel a plant leaf is actually kind of waxy, if that makes sense. That's the cuticle you're feeling right there. It's also transparent and see-through, which is really important because light literally has to be able to go through and not get blocked by this cuticle. Okay, so that's kind of the top layer. By the way, it's also on the bottom. You might notice that these exact same cells that are on the top are on the bottom side of the leaf too. The next layer down has a name. It's on my future slides. It's called palisade cells. I'll write it out here and you can get it from future slides. These are called palisade. Palisade. And basically the idea behind these cells is that they're long cells and they're packed with chloroplasts. You guys remember what chloroplasts are used for? What are they used for? Photosynthesis. Yeah. Remember how in the Magic School Bus episode they kind of like walked into the cell and like hopped on these chloroplasts and they kind of went all the way up to the top and around again? So they're covered in chloroplasts because the chloroplasts are what do the photosynthesis. I like to think of this as like a solar panel where all of these are all lined up really nicely in a row because it wants to maximize as much photosynthesis as you can get. So that's called your palisade tissue cells. You guys remember what the ones below them were called? It's actually based on like the idea of there being holes in it and a humanly designed instrument that also has holes in it. I'm not guiding you very well. It's called spongy tissue. These guys down here are spongy tissue cells. Okay. Now, 1 cell would be a spongy tissue cell. All of them together is known as spongy tissue. And the big difference is, can you guys see how there's like some gaps in the middle here? The gaps are because you need to get carbon dioxide in and you need to get oxygen out. And so therefore they cannot be tightly packed together. Because if they were tightly compacted together, it'd be really hard to get the gases in and out. These guys right here, they actually do still have chloroplasts, just nowhere near as many as the guys up top, because really, like the guys up top, they're the main contributors to making food. So, but these guys down here can do this as well. The other thing that we need to talk about is the tubing that runs through the entire leaf. And I kind of drew a really basic picture of like, imagine this was a leaf right here. You ever see how like there's like a line that kind of goes through the middle and it kind of looks maybe like this? Right? That might be a leaf to somebody. These lines right here, that's this stuff right here, and it's called vascular tissue. And basically, it's like your veins and arteries. Only rather than carrying blood, do you guys remember the 2 things that vascular tissue is supposed to carry? Water, and then once you've made it, sugar. Nice, yeah. Water and sugar. I can write it here. I know I have it on future slides, but xylem is all about water, and phloem is all about sugar. Which way does the water flow? Up, yeah, because we need the water to come from the roots up to the leaves. The phloem, it then goes, yeah, like out though, right? Like it goes backwards the other way, right? Because the sugar then needs to go back down to the roots and to the blossoms, right? So, but the water specifically has to go to leaves. The sugar then has to go like everywhere. So, in terms of words, you guys should probably write down. We can do this now, or you can do it later. But you should know about palisade tissue, spongy tissue, and vascular tissue. And most of that I have on upcoming slides. So. The other thing that's on this picture here that we can probably talk about is called the stomata. A stomata is actually a hole that things go through. And I've got pictures of this later, but really a stomata is made up of something called guard cells. The idea being that their job is to literally guard against things getting in and out of the plant. I'll use my hands to kind of illustrate it. Here's a guard cell, here's a second guard cell. They're right tight next to each other. They're happy. This is closed. Fill them with water, and all of a sudden, you know how like you fill something with water, it starts to like expand and swell a little bit? Well, it expands and swells, and when there's lots of water, well, now there's an opening, and now stuff can go through. That's all, right? So only if there's enough water will the guard cells actually open. Hence the name guard cells, because you don't want to waste your water supply unless you have enough to do your reaction. So, okay, so here's some of my verbal, like my written notes on what we just talked about here. You know that cuticle I mentioned? Cuticle is that outside layer. It's actually under the category of what's called dermal tissue. So if you want to write another one down here, dermal tissue is the outside layer of cells. And we call it the cuticle. So it's both on the top and on the bottom of the leaf. And it is 1 cell thick. I don't know that this next part's really relevant, but you might find this interesting at least. What happens when a tree starts to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, though? Eventually, it starts to turn into like wood. Okay, and so the dermal tissue can also be like cork or say like bark, not like dog bark. You guys know what I mean when I say bark around a tree, right? So when a plant starts to get big enough, then this would also be considered dermal tissue. We're not going to focus on that. We're going to mostly focus on just like the leaf outside tissue. But yeah, dermal tissue would basically be an overall description for anything that is like on the outside layer. So just like in humans, it would be our skin. Right? So, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, we'll go to the next slide here. Okay, ground tissue is the words we use to describe the spongy and the palisade. Okay, ground tissue would be either of these two things. And really, it's like the inside part. Okay, anything that's on the inside is considered ground tissue. So we know of at least two types. I like this picture right here as like a cross section of a leaf. The very, very outside most edge is the dermal tissue. The ground tissue is the stuff on like the inside. And then I already mentioned this word earlier. Vascular tissue is like the transportation vessels for the water and the sugar. So those are your main types of tissues. Yeah, I don't really know much more to add here. You guys can kind of copy this down later if you need. I'm going to show you some pictures in a second here of the vascular tissue. Maybe I'll go to the pictures here first. Where is it? Bear with me. I'm going to find the picture of it. Here it is. This is what xylem would look like. Okay, xylem is all of these cells. Remember when Magic School Bus literally went in the plant for the first time? I paused the video and I point out there were like some holes in the cells. That's what xylem has. They have these pits in the wall where literally like as long as it's a small enough item, the item can literally just fit right through. Right? If it was a bug is too big to fit through there. But a single atom or molecule of water should be able to literally like fit through these little holes there in the xylem. Where were we there? Yeah. So what ends up happening is as the cells mature, they fuse together and the walls become perforated, meaning that like there's actually like holes to fit through. Also, something else that's important. The cytoplasm breaks down and the cell actually dies. Here's why this is really important. A cell, as we learned last week, has a nucleus and cytoplasm and ribosomes and all that other crap that's inside there, right? It's actually very inefficient to put water in that because there's so much stuff it needs to get through. So what actually ends up happening is the cells inside the vascular tissue, they're actually dead cells. And it's like a straw, which I think is kind of cool. I gave the analogy before of having like a whole bunch of toilet paper tubes being like stacked on top of each other. The inside of the toilet paper tube used to have living cell contents in it, but they've all died. And now basically if you stack them on top of each other, you could suck water right through it. Does that make sense? And so that's what I've got. Let me skip ahead. I don't know why I put these slides so far apart, but that's what this picture here is supposed to be like. You have this cell next to this cell next to this cell next to this cell, but all of these cells are literally empty inside. Okay. There's a name for this. It's called a trachid. I'm sure I have it in a future slide here, though. Where is it? Maybe I don't have the name in there. Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Phloem is what does the sugar. So phloem does the sugar, and it has to go from the leaves to everywhere else. And these guys right here are also very similar. They also have perforated ends, but there's actually still cytoplasm inside. Okay. They're called sieve tube cells. And one of the cool things about them is that they actually are alive, but they have no nucleus. Okay? So the water-containing cells, literally everything's gone from the inside. Just hollow it right out and make a straw out of it. The xylem, what ends up happening, oh sorry, that was xylem. The phloem is what carries sugar. What you end up having is, again, you have a tube, but again, if you want to put sugar through it, it takes a long time to do that when it's full. So this is kind of clever. They take the nucleus out of the cell. The nucleus dies out. And what they have is what's called a companion cell. And I'll show you the picture here. But the companion cell means the nucleus is on the outside of the cell, which is very strange. Here's my picture of it. This is a sieve tube cell right here. And what you've got is a little cell right next to it. See how there's these extra little blue guys right next to it here? This thing right here is living, and it has a nucleus. But these guys right here, they have everything else they need to live, minus the brain, because the brain's on the outside. But you know what that does is it makes more room on the inside for you to be able to store all the sugar. In my mind, I think of a silly analogy. I think of like one of those like classic cartoons where there's like two henchmen. And like one of the henchmen is like the big burly guy that's like 6 feet tall, but he's like dumb as rocks, right? And like who goes with the big burly henchman? The short guy who's like super smart. You know what I'm talking about? Like a cartoon like that. And to me, that's what I think of here. Is what you have is you have what's called the sieve tube cells, and it is really big and dumb as rocks because it has no nucleus. And next to it is this thing called a companion cell, and it basically tells the big cell what to do. So you carry sugar, you carry sugar. But like this cell right here doesn't actually do any of the work. It just tells the other guy to do that. So if I can go back to my notes right here, wherever they were here. If you want to write this out, it's called a sieve tube cell. Okay. Sieve tube cells are what carry the phloem. It's like the dumb big brute who has no brain because a companion cell tells it what to do. So I'll do a recap on this after you guys have written down what you want here. Sieve tube cells are what the phloem is made out of, and they have no nucleus, but they have companion cells as a brain next to them. So maybe I'll just draw it again right here. You might have this guy and this guy right here, and this would be a sieve tube. And then next to it, you might have a whole bunch of these guys here. And that would be the companion cells, because these guys actually do have brains. They have nucleuses. But this guy is hopefully supposed to be kind of like hollow in the middle. Why is there room in the middle now? There's no nucleus. Whereas this one right here, this top paragraph, by the way, is still talking about xylem. Xylem is empty all the way through. Okay. Xylem is literally just empty all the way through, and there's literally nothing inside there. And it's like a straw. You've got some edges for things to get into, but that's why this one's like a straw. And there's literally nothing inside it whatsoever. So, quick recap again then. Xylem cells, like a straw, completely dead. All that's left is the cell wall, and basically a whole bunch of toilet paper tubes stacked on top of each other that makes a straw. Nothing inside of it. Phloem goes through sieve tube cells, big cells that have emptiness in the middle. Why is there emptiness in the middle? No nucleus. These things are dumb as rocks. But fortunately, the big bully of a brute has these little nuclei attached to the outside, and the short little henchman tells the big guy what to do. Okay, So I'll go back to that picture one more time here so you can kind of see them. And we'll finish with this. Here's the xylem, empty, open cells. And then the phloem is the sieve tube, and there's open hollowness through there. They are dead, and so are these guys right here. These guys are both dead, but this guy has a living cell next to it telling it what to do. So xylem and phloem are the vascular tissue, and it's where all the water and sugar flows through. Here's another picture. I don't think we need to go over this one quite as much. Here's another picture of it again then. The cuticle is your top layer. Your palisade are the topmost cells that do most of the photosynthesis. Below that is the spongy cells that are kind of a little bit everywhere. But running throughout the entire thing like a grid system is xylem and phloem, and they always go together in like bundles. And so you always have like this one and this one directly next to each other, kind of like packaged together. They often call them bundles, is a word we might use. Okay. Here's another picture, but again, it's kind of the same thing. Cuticle on top, epidermis or dermis is on top, palisades there, spongy layers in between, the gases can get through, and if you get a cross section, you'll have xylem and phloem kind of mixed together as your tubing throughout the whole thing. So, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I feel like I'm saying the same thing, so I'll move on here. Let's talk a bit more about the different types of cells then. The dermal cells then, if you hadn't already wrote those ones down, that was the top and bottom layer. That's the dermal tissue, okay? And on the top, you have the cuticle, but on the bottom, you have those guard cells. Okay? And those guard cells are the two cells that when they're side by side, they're closed, but fill them with water, they open up. And the whole point of it is what I'm going to highlight right here. It's all about gas exchange. Okay? You have to bring carbon dioxide into the plant, and you have to kick back out the oxygen. As a side note, plants are actually super important to humans. If we killed off all the plants, we would die. Two reasons. One, we eat plants. Or if we don't eat plants, we eat things that eat things that eat plants. Right? Like when Harrison was here, he taught you guys a little bit about like pyramids and how there's like the bottom level and there's the next level up and it's like 10% each level. Yeah, trophic levels. You guys remember that stuff? Right? So, I mean, if you as a human don't necessarily eat a lot of plants or vegetables, I mean, you're ultimately eating that though indirectly. Like say you eat a steak, right? You're eating cow, but that cow was probably fed some sort of grain which came from a plant. So indirectly you're eating plants, right? So one, plants are important for that. But two, plants are also important because if they don't take out carbon dioxide and make oxygen, we couldn't breathe. So like it's actually brilliant the way our world works. We breathe in oxygen and out carbon dioxide, and plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. So it's like the yin and yang or the heads and tails of a coin. Like it's super important that we keep our plants alive. So, okay, let's move forward here. Next slide here. You guys need to know a chloroplast. A chloroplast is something we mentioned in our first set of notes. It is an organelle. You guys remember organelles? Like that would be like your nucleus, your mitochondria, your endoplasmic reticulum. So a chloroplast is very special to only plants. It is the special thing that does photosynthesis. And so one of the things you guys should know is the equation for photosynthesis. Here's the recipe. You need water, which is H2O, which is actually down here. I won't bother writing it. You need carbon dioxide, which is CO2. And you also need to have a chloroplast. And the reason why is that chloroplasts contain something called chlorophyll. Chloroplasts contain chlorophyll and basically put this, and this all together. Water, carbon dioxide, the chlorophyll pigment, and light. And what you can do is you can make yourself glucose. Glucose is basically sugar. And a plant makes its own sugar. So you guys should probably write down this equation here because I'm pretty sure it's one of my test questions on the final. This is the equation for photosynthesis then. And it's actually balanced for you. So you probably should just write it out so you have it somewhere. While you guys are writing, I'll just kind of talk over your working here. Inside a cell, you guys will recall a cell is supposed to have nucleuses and mitochondria and all that other crap inside, right? The main part of a cell, though, like the main bulk of the interior of the cell, is called cytoplasm. You guys remember that? To me, cytoplasm is like the jelly that's inside. Like if I was having like a fruit salad made with like Jello salad, oh, the Jello is like the main cytoplasm. What's cool about the chloroplasts then? They don't stay in one spot. The chloroplasts literally can like cycle throughout a cell. They actually have the ability to move. And this makes total sense because on the bottom side of the cell is where they would pick up their carbon dioxide and their water. They would then move to the top of the cell where they then get exposure to light, and that completes the reaction. And we actually saw that in the Magic School Bus where they literally like hopped on the chloroplasts, rode to the top, and that's where they finally had the epiphany, hey, look at this white stuff is sugar. Does that make sense? So I just need you guys to know that these organelles are not stationary. They actually have the ability to move. They can actually like cycle through that cytoplasm. It's kind of cool. Okay. This slide doesn't really add anything that I haven't really talked about. I'll just kind of read off of it. So in photosynthesis, light is absorbed by chlorophyll and it gets converted to energy in the form of glucose, which is like that sugar stuff, that white sugar that they found in the Magic School Bus. I already pointed out to you guys as well. You guys know this a little bit because our syrup comes from maple trees, right? And so like the sap is actually sugary, right? Oh, here's what I was just talking about. Chloroplasts have the ability to move. Here it is. It's called cytoplasmic streaming. Maybe you could write that one down. I don't think I have that on my final, but it would never hurt. So the basic idea is that when you have that cell that looks like this side of the cell is where the light might be coming from. This side of the cell might be where, say, the water and the carbon dioxide are coming from. And like, it's actually going to have to like travel up and then back down in a circle. And so the organelle doesn't actually like stay in one spot. The cell stays in one spot. But inside, there's actually like a, I don't know, like a racetrack going on, I guess. So, okay, let's spend some time talking about the gas exchange in plants then. So some of the other words we talked about were the words stomata. Okay. A stomata is actually an opening. It's kind of weird, but like stomata is actually nothing. When there's nothing there, you have a stomata. Right? Here's my two hands. I open them up. What's in between my hands here? Yeah, nothing. And since I can see through the nothing, that's a stomata. What is a stomata made of? It's made of guard cells. Okay, so a stomata is the opening between guard cells. Okay, and I have another name for it. It's called turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is basically what forces the cells to warp. So this is what I've been trying to do with my hands. Can you guys see these cells right here? See this little white section right here? That is storage. And we have a name for the storage compartment in cells. It's called a vacuole. And right now, this storage compartment is relatively empty because there's really no water inside of it. But imagine that you super filled it, so full that eventually this thing right here is like, it's like a water balloon that's like ready to burst. Does that make sense? Well, you know what ends up happening is because it's so big, it actually causes, rather than it being straight, it actually has to kind of like bend in order for it to fit, right? And we actually know this in other places too. Like water can cause like wood to eventually bend over time too, right? Anyone work in construction and seen that before? The baseboards in my bathroom are always warped because the water that ends up kind of leaking into them causes them to like swell outwards a little bit. So anyways, you guys can kind of see here, this vacuole right here is so full of water that it causes a bending, and now there's an opening. And now basically what can happen is CO2 can go in and oxygen can come out. So the name for this then, turgor pressure. When there's so much water shoved inside of these vacuoles that it causes the guard cells to basically open themselves up. That's what it's called, turgor pressure. I don't know, maybe it's kind of like a flexing hockey stick in a way, right? Like it's supposed to be straight, but you put some pressure on it, you torque it, and all of a sudden you get a little bit of flex and build into it. Maybe that's a good analogy. It's like flexing the hockey stick. It was straight here, and now it's bending. Okay. Does this make sense to you guys, by the way? I should pause and make sure you're good. Really, both biology and the geology unit we're going to do next, it's mostly just like I tell you stuff and you go, cool, that's what it's called. Okay. Right? Like that's kind of the main concept. There's not necessarily a lot of groundbreaking info. It's mostly just learning what the thing is and what we call it. Okay. Um, the word I need you guys to know on here is something called transpiration. And I need to pause for a second here and kind of describe the water concept again. So you guys recall, xylem is what water goes through, and water is like it goes through it like a straw. Okay. The word transpiration basically describes how water gets sucked up the straw. It's a fancy word for evaporation. Okay. Imagine that we were in elementary school. I'll use like my daughter's kindergarten class as an example. You know how when you guys go down the hallway, you just literally walk wherever the heck you want, right? But you remember what they do back in kindergarten when they walk down the hall, right? Like they all like hold hands or they all hold a rope, right? They're all really cute when they're super little, right? Because they don't want anybody to get lost. You know what I mean? And literally what happens is the first person leads the second person, and the second person leads the third person, and the third one leads the fourth, and you basically get pulled along. Okay? To me, that's the analogy I think of when I think of what's called transpiration. Because in order for water to get from the roots to the top, what ends up happening is a little bit of water evaporates. Remember how the stomata opened? Well, a little bit of water evaporates, and that evaporating particle pulls the one behind it, and that one pulls the one behind it, and that one pulls the one behind it. And that's basically how the straw works. Because remember how the xylem were dead? There's no way for the individual xylem cells to move water from this dead cell to this dead cell to this dead cell. In phloem, it can, because the phloem cells are dead too, right? Remember what phloem had next to it, though? Was the brain guys on the outside, right? Xylem has none of that. So the only way it works is if evaporation happens, okay? Water vapor leaves the leaf. And literally, as one water particle evaporates, it pulls the one behind it, which pulls the one behind it, which pulls the one behind it. And that's what sucks the water up through the xylem. So, in that same analogy, when I think of my daughter's kindergarten class, when the teacher leads the first kid, then the first kid leads the second kid, which leads the third one, they just basically, it's a big chain reaction. Does that make sense? And that's how you get water up the plant. Because otherwise, why would water go up? Which way do things normally fall? Down, right? So that then answers the question as to how water actually goes from the roots up to the top. It literally gets sucked up. But it only gets sucked up when this opens. Because as soon as the opening goes through, the first guy goes, hey, I'm leaving. And then everybody else gets pulled through. So anyways, that's called transpiration. If I'm reading kind of through the notes here, high oxygen and low carbon dioxide affect the stomata. In conditions then where water is not available, those guard cells then close. Because the worst thing that could happen is that you're not ready to do photosynthesis, and the cell is open, and all of the water starts evaporating. Well, eventually all the water is gone, and now the plant's going to die, right? So that's its defense mechanism. Cactuses, there are more than one cactus, they are really good at this because cactuses, they don't get a lot of water being in like the Arizona desert. And so only when conditions are right do they actually then open up those stomata to let the gases escape. So, okay, another word I should have you guys know is a word called a lenticel. Lenticel. Sometimes I call it a lenticle. I'm not sure whether I'm saying it right, but I think it's lenticel. Okay, and you know how we talked about dermal tissue earlier today and how the dermal tissue on a leaf is the waxy coating, but the dermal tissue on a tree could be like its bark? Well, bark also needs to have ways for air to get in and out as well. And that's what those are called. They're called lenticels. And so basically, if you have and try not to laugh too much here, but if you have a woody plant, which is basically something that has like bark around it, right? Then there are openings there. And I've got a great picture on the next slide of what a lenticel looks like, because I'm sure you've seen these before. You just didn't know what they were called. So I'll let you write it out, and then you can see the picture here. This is a picture of a lenticel. You guys ever seen one of these before in a tree? Right? They're these like little, I don't know, like opening sections. This is basically like the stomata on something that's made of wood, right? The idea being that oxygen should be able to get in and out of there, and then same thing with water, right? Because think of a big tree, right? Some of those big trees in like the, I don't know, like the Pacific Northwest, like some of those big, massive ones, they're super big, right? How in the world do you suck water all the way up to the top? Well, that's where these things come in, right? Because imagine this is like a straw, and water is evaporating out of that one there, right? Well, then it can start to suck it up the roots there. And then this one sucks it up a little bit further, right? And so do you lose a couple of water molecules due to evaporation? Sure, you lose a couple, but the rest get sucked up like a vacuum cleaner, like a straw. So those are lenticels. Basically, think of them as stomata, only on something made of wood rather than something made of leaf. Here's a picture that kind of describes what we've basically been discussing then. Water comes in through the roots, and then how does water get all the way up to the top? Well, it gets up to the top because of this transpiration, this evaporation thing, and literally it just gets pulled one at a time all the way through there. Meanwhile, say some of the water ends up getting used for photosynthesis in the leaf, then the sugar, the phloem, it then has to go back down again, and maybe not necessarily even down here, but it also might need to go that way or that way or that way. The phloem needs to go every way. So that's why I like the straw analogy. The xylem is only getting sucked up through a straw, but the phloem, that's why it needs to have that buddy, that brain next to it to tell it where to go. Because you got to put the sugar everywhere for the plant to grow. Right? I bet you a lot of it ends up being in blossoms, right? And flower petals and the sexual reproductive organs of a plant, like when the bee gets its nectar, right? That's where a lot of the sugar needs to go as well. Okay. Yeah, we're probably good on this one here because this slide basically talks about transpiration again. So I think I've discussed that enough. I think we're about done because then this is our final picture, the idea of xylem, right? So one more time, xylem is dead cells, empty right through the middle. There's no stuff inside of it. The only reason why water goes up then is it literally gets sucked through. Phloem is two things. It is the sieve tube cell, and it's the companion cell. And those two things collectively, this guy's got a hole in the middle because there's no brain inside it anymore. The brain's now on the outside, and that's why it can actually go through. But it can either go this way or this way. It doesn't just have to go up. It can go up or down or left or right, whichever way the brain decides to tell it to send the sugar to. Yeah, I think that's pretty much the basics. That's kind of what this picture here describes then. Xylem, water only goes up, whereas phloem can go up or down because there's a brain next to it. I think I'm done. Any questions? No, I actually have half an hour left still. Yeah, so that pretty much covers most of the curriculum. Obviously, we didn't do every single little bit there, but do you guys feel like you understand that stuff? So, okay. So here's what we'll do. I'm putting more thought into this. I think that for your final exam, because it's really only you guys plus Chelsea and Riley who can worry about this. For your science and final exam, I think I'm going to make it out of 45 questions. 15 questions in chem, 15 in physics, 15 in bio. And then what I'll do is that if you don't pass a section, or if you don't pass it overall, I'll make sure I have extra questions. And so like if it's out of 45, as long as you get, let's say 22, because that's slightly less than half. If you get 22 questions right out of 45 total, as soon as you hit 22, you're done. You can walk out and I can give you the principal's pass. Does that make sense? If after 45 questions you haven't hit 22, then I'll just keep adding more questions in. And what I can do is I can put them in. I'll make sure that I put lots of extra questions in for chem, bio, and physics. And maybe at first I can let you kind of choose and say, well, what would you like to have more of? Would you want to do more chem or more bio or more physics? Just that way you can kind of like cater it to whatever your strengths happen to be. Does that make sense? And so the only issue then is that once it's out of then 46, then you'd have to get to like 23 out of 46. And once you get to 50, you'd have to have 25 out of 50, right? So you'd have to get enough questions right until you get to half of whatever you've written. So at a certain point, I think I'm probably going to have to quit, I guess, if like, we've gotten to a point where it's like I've given you 100 questions and you still haven't gotten half of them. We may have to reconsider that. So I hope it doesn't ever come to that. Yeah, I hope it doesn't come to that. But does that make sense? that's kind of my plan. So 15 on each section. I feel like with what I've taught you guys in chemistry, since we have a little bit of time right here, in terms of Science 10 for chemistry, there's really 3 chapters to it. Chapter 1 in chemistry is all about you knowing protons, neutrons, and electrons. And so if I were to ask you a question that's something like this, if I were to say copper 2 plus, if I were to say how many protons and electrons are there? You guys think you could do that? So how would you find out how many protons are on copper? Periodic table, yeah. So I'm pretty sure, well, let's look it up here. Copper is number 29. So then copper would have 29 protons. If it's 2 plus, though, how many electrons does it have? The answer is 27. I like your thought process because it was either up by 2 or down by 2. So if you can figure that part out, then you just got to figure, well, how do you get 2 plus? Well, if you get 2 plus, you better have 2 more of the pluses than you have of the minuses. So if you can answer a question like that, that's kind of like one of the first chapters. Or I'll give you another one. I might need to ask you about isotopes. That's where I give you like carbon 12 and a 6 here. Now, carbon has, if I asked you about protons, carbon has 6 protons because it's number 6 down here. If I ask you how many neutrons it has, the answer would also be 6. The reason why is that 6 plus 6 equals 12. If I gave you carbon 13, it would have 6 protons instead of neutrons. So that's like one part of it. Another one of the outcomes from Science 10 is about naming stuff. So if I gave you, like, say, MgCl2, could you name that? That's magnesium chloride. If I were to give you, let's say this, let's say I told you lead 4 bromide. Would you be able to get to this part here? We'd say, okay, well, we need a lead and we need a bromine. And then if lead is a +4 and bromine, I happen to know, by the way, is -1, you would know that you need to have 4 of those to make it work. That's lead 4 bromide. Then the final outcome is probably the one that you're going to probably struggle the most with. It's where you have to balance equations. And so that would be where if I give you like CuSO4 plus HBr turns into H2SO4 plus CuBr, where you'd have to like balance by saying, okay, I need like say 2 of these to balance the hydrogens, and I need 2 of those, and I need 2 of those. You know what I mean? Like where you have to put like the numbers in front. Okay. So that's more or less the chemistry curriculum. I realized I actually made a mistake. There should be a 2 on that for it to work, which means you would need to have. Anyways, so those are the outcomes in chemistry. Physics is mostly about knowing how to use certain formulas, and we did a lot of the formula math stuff. Yeah, I know. You guys weren't in love with that part either. So if I gave you a formula like V equals D over T, you guys remember doing that one? Okay. The other one would be A equals V over T. Another one would have been that the potential energy is mass times gravity times height, or the kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared. When we're reviewing for Science 20, I think it's going to cover the Science 10 stuff as well, because really the Science 10 stuff is actually really similar. It's just the first time that you would have practiced those formulas. There's a few other ones in there. One of the other ones you need to know how to do that we never did is this one. It's work equals force times distance. So honestly, it's really straightforward, though. If I give you a force and a distance, you times them by each other. Or if I tell you that work is 25, and I tell you that force is 5, how would you get d by itself? Divide by 5, yeah. Okay. So most of the hardest formulas were actually specifically from Physics 20. So if you can do the math type stuff, which I know wasn't maybe your favorite part there, but if you can get just enough on it, hopefully that helps. So we can probably do some review of this during like in terms of schedule. I don't know whether you guys have you guys seen the final exam schedule yet? Here, come gather around here. I got one up here so you guys can kind of see what we're up to. So our last day of classes is 3 weeks, so that's the 15th, which is a Friday, and then you guys more or less get like most of a week off. The 18th, only people who are here writing chemistry. Do you guys have English? Although I've heard that English is getting done in class or something. Is that right? Okay. Okay. So honestly, you guys don't actually have anything this entire week of classes. Yeah, because if you're doing English in class, what else do you guys have for classes that require finals? This and English. Yeah. So then what would happen is you'd write the Science 10 challenge on the 25th, and on the 26th you do the Science 20 final. So we would have like an entire week, and if you guys want, I can totally help you guys do some review on some of the things you studying. So, yeah. So that week there. So you basically you have an entire week off there. Yeah. So and then yeah, basically as long as you can pass, because really here's how this works. When you guys get your principals pass, you basically you either get a P for pass or you don't. So like whether you get 60% on that final or 100% or 50.01%, it honestly does not matter. You know what I'm saying? Like it is either yes you passed it or no you didn't.
49.9 clear. We're not rounding.
No, that week still has classes. This week it has classes up until then. And then this week, as long as you don't have that English 21, then you'd have off. And you just have to come for these 2 days. Okay, that's all I've got for today. Do you guys have any questions for me or any things I can help with? Okay, I'm done for the day. So if you guys wanted to, I don't know, if you got things to work on, you're welcome to stick around and work on that. If you guys are done, as long as you're not leaving the building, you guys can go work somewhere else if you want. If you are leaving, well, you really can't leave without officially signing out, I guess. So I don't know. I'm done for the day, I guess. So that work? Let me know how I can help with things. So maybe here's what you should do: print off your notes for the rest of the evening. Actually. So we'll start the geology stuff tomorrow.